An epithet is a byword, a characterizing word or phrase that accompanies or is used in place of the name of a person or a thing. Perhaps one of the most famous epithets in history refers to the 4th century Macedonian king Alexander, who is almost universally known today as Alexander the Great. You would probably recognize that appellation, but the funny thing is that he probably wouldn't. Not just because he spoke ancient Macedonian instead of English, but also because the first known use of the term the Great to refer to Alexander didn't occur until more than a century after his death.
It's difficult to say when the practice of adding epithets to names began, but it was very early. Epithets were commonly used, for example, in ancient Mesopotamia to reference deities. Manuel Ceccarelli of the University of Bern Institute of Archaeological Sciences explained in a 2021 edition of the Journal of Ancient Near Eastern Religions that since incantations and incantation prayers must be effective, they are enhanced by a variety of strategies. Divine epithets can be understood as strategies used to improve the effectiveness of ritual speeches. They evoke divine qualities that are relevant for a particular context and allow for a more effective interaction with the deities. The goddess worshipped in Sumer as Inanna and as Ishtar by the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Sumerians, represented many things: love, fertility, beauty, but also war, political power, and divine law. As such, the goddess was referred to in various records by many epithets, each referencing specific attributes or, at times, place names of cities with which the goddess might be associated. Surat Nineveh was an epithet meaning Ishtar of Nineveh, whereas the epithet Labatu means lioness, a relation to her martial prowess in war. The lexical list Ad Annum, a list of gods dated to the Old Babylonian period around the 2nd millennium BC, lists more than 70 epithets or secondary names for Ishtar. This was common among many ancient civilizations. The Hindu deity Shiva, whose worship also began in the 3rd millennium BC, also has many epithets representing different aspects of the god. Encyclopedia Britannica notes among his common epithets are Shambhu, benign, Shankara, beneficent, Mahesha, good lord, and Mahadeva, great god. The World History Encyclopedia notes that the Aztec god Tezcatlopalca had numerous, perhaps hundreds of epithets, including Lord of the Shadows and Precious Owl. Deities of the Egyptian pantheon also frequently had epithets. The ancient Egyptian god of fertility, Osiris, would often be named with the epithets possessor of splendor, lord of silence, or the beautiful one. But researcher Peter Lundstrom notes on the website Pharaoh that epithets were also included in hieroglyphic titles of pharaohs. There was, he explains, a 5-fold titulary for kings, which means that a pharaoh might have up to 5 names, representing different aspects of their reign. But each of these might have an epithet added inside or outside their cartouche, including strong bull or true of voice, which Lundstrom explains would be placed after the cartouche and used to indicate that the king had died and become a god. Epithets are often descriptive and act as a mnemonic to aid memory. Epithets are common in the world of the 8th century BC Greek poet Homer, where the epithet not only makes a character more memorable, but serves to aid the poet in matching meter. Homer uses epithets to refer to many things. He refers to the Trojans, for example, as tamers of horses, the god Zeus as delighting in thunder, and Odysseus' ship as well-balanced. The hero Achilles was swift-footed and lion-hearted, while Odysseus was great-hearted, master mariner, and beloved of Zeus. Epithets can be used to refer to almost anything. While epithets are often adjectives, epithets are more specific, used as part of or often in place of a name. Thus, a fire might be referred to as great, but the Great Fire of Constantinople is an epithet, which might be used to distinguish between events. While an epithet is a type of nickname, not all nicknames would be classified as an epithet, with nicknames typically being more casual and familiar and epithets being more formal and descriptive. Epithets, however, have been particularly descriptive for people. For example, the first known literary use of the epithet the Great, used to refer to Alexander, was in a comedy written by the Roman playwright Plautus, written around the 3rd century BC, more than 100 years after his death. Alexander doesn't appear to have ever been called the Great during his lifetime, although the ancient history website levis.org notes that Alexander took on the epithets son of Ra and son of Zeus after his conquest of Egypt. And the website Classical Wisdom notes that he often was given less than complimentary epithets in conquered lands where his campaigns killed thousands. The website notes that in the East he was known as the Accursed One and the Two-Horned Satan. Roman emperors often had epithets written into their titles. Roman emperors Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, for example, had the name Germanicus added to their title. The name means conqueror of the Germans. But none of those emperors actually conquered any Germans. The epithet was inherited from Roman general Nero Claudius Drusus, who was awarded the epithet Germanicus after his death, referring to campaigns across the Rhine in the 1st century BC. The addition of the epithet to the emperor's titles was in order to associate that emperor with the Julio-Claudian dynasty, while the 3rd century AD Emperor Aurelian was granted the title Germanicus Maximus, meaning great victor in Germania, for his victories in northern Italy in 271 AD. These so-called victory titles were common epithets. Aurelian was also given the epithet Gothicus Maximus for victories over the Goths, and the epithet Restitutor Orbis, meaning restorer of the world, for his reuniting lost parts of the empire. Interestingly, Emperor Caligula was not actually named Caligula. Rather, that was a nickname coined by his father's troops when he was brought on campaign as a child. As History.com explains, either affectionately or mockingly, Germanicus's troops called the boy Caligula, meaning little boots or booties. While he is today generally recognized by that name, its informal nature makes it properly a nickname rather than an epithet. However, as the name, which he disliked in adulthood, was often used pejoratively by his enemies, it might be considered an unflattering epithet. If so, it wouldn't be unique. Some of the most notable epithets in history have been bestowed by enemies trying to besmirch a rival. The 8th century Byzantium ruler Constantine V was generally successful, but he supported iconoclasm, the idea that it was wrong to venerate religious images. Iconoclasm was later deemed to be heretical, leading subsequent historians to coin the insulting epithet, the dung-named, based on a story, almost certainly untrue, that he had defecated in the water at his baptism. 16th century Russian Tsar Ivan Vasilyevich is so well known as Ivan the Terrible that Harvard professor of history Edward Kennan wrote in a 2006 edition of Harvard Ukrainian Studies that the byname is now so ubiquitous and internalized that it readily comes to the tongue in discussions of guards at prison camps named Ivan, or professional wrestlers who are not even named Ivan but may be terrible. But, Kennan notes, bynames were not commonly used in Muscovy, and Ivan was not known by that name in his lifetime. Rather, he argues the epithet was only coined nearly 2 centuries after his death, was derived from a combination of the native anti-Romanov prejudice of the 17th century and anti-Ivan Western literary tradition and the early modern European practice of assigning bynames to dynasts. If the epithet was, as he argues, the result of prejudice that occurred centuries after his death, that doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't accurate, as Kennan notes, all of which, I repeat, is not to say that Ivan wasn't nasty. That is a different question. Epithets became more common in Europe during the Middle Ages, probably to distinguish between people who had the same names. Brittany Price wrote in the journal The Conversation in 2016, for example, that nicknames were especially important to Viking-age Scandinavians, as evidence suggests that their stock of given names was extremely thin. This resulted, she argues, in some interesting epithets. She continues, their nicknames function in the same way that we're used to. Each described a particular aspect of an individual's nature or life that carried particular resonance. This was not always desirable. Names such as Ulf the Squint-Eyed, Elric Ale-Lover, Eystein Foul-Fart, and some that are even worse, demonstrate that people rarely had a say in the nicknames that they carried. Vikings weren't the only ones who struggled with a thin stock of given names. There were 18 French monarchs named Louis between the 8th century and the 18th century. Epithets are an easy way of distinguishing among them. Louis X argued with his nobility, thus earning the epithet the Quarrelsome. Louis II had a speech impediment and was called the Stammerer. Oren Gray notes on the website The Archive in 2022 that Louis V, the last Carolinian ruler of France, was called the Do-Nothing because he didn't accomplish a whole lot. But Louis weren't the only problem in France. The 1st century AD Frankish leader Charles carried the epithet Martel, meaning in Old French, the hammer, after his victory in the 732 Battle of Tours, the subject of another episode of the History Guy. His grandson was named after him. That Charles was also famous for military victories and expansion of the Carolinian Empire. He was apparently referred to in some chronicles as the Great King during his lifetime, although it isn't clear if the French version of that name, Charles Le Mans or Charlemagne, meaning Charles the Great, was used in his lifetime. but it was used in a history of his rule written around 900 AD, less than 100 years after his death, thus distinguishing his rule from that of his grandfather of the same name. And his grandson, who ruled between 875 to 877, was also named Charles. His epithet was less flattering, being known as Charles the Bald. The epithet appears to have been used in his lifetime, although strangely he is portrayed in the period art as having a full head of hair. British historian Janet Nelson suggests in her 1993 book On the King that the epithet may have been deliberately ironic, whereas historian Reinhard Leiby suggested in 2003 that the epithet may have referred to his lack of land. In either case, the epithet would allow historians to distinguish him from other famous Charleses of the dynasty, including his grandson, the last ruler of the dynasty, saddled with the even less flattering epithet Charles the Fat. Unlike his grandfather, the name does not appear to have been used in his time, and there's no clear physical description to explain it. The epithet was coined in a book called the Annalista Saxo, or the Saxon Annals, in the 12th century, and likely refers to a reign that was seen as indecisive and lazy. Still, later depictions of him often portray him as being large, based on the 12th century epithet, which was not based on any period description. The confusing nature of epithets shows if Charles the Bald was not bald and Charles the Fat was not fat. And that was not uncommon. Charles Meltel's son Pepin is referred to by the common epithet the Short. While some historians suggest that he might have been small-statured, that might not have been the case. Dr. Gary Gerard of the French History Podcast writes, Pepin is near universally called the Short in the Anglosphere due to a mistranslation of the French, Pipin le Bref, better translated as Pepin the Brief. Pepin ruled as the king of the France for 17 years, which is hardly brief, but historians consistently measure Pepin against his father and son. Charles Martel ruled Francia as duke and princeps for 23 years, and his son Charlemagne ruled as king and later emperor for 46 years. Some nicknames appear to have been fairly descriptive. The 14th century Arab scholar Ibn Khaldun wrote that Alfonso IX, king of Leon and Galatia, was called Baboso, meaning the Slobberer. While described as generally successful, Ibn Khaldun writes that the epithet referred to his tendency to foam at the mouth when in a fit of rage. Other epithets were also descriptive. King John of England, who ruled from 1199 to 1216 and is commonly portrayed as the villain of Robin Hood legends, was originally given the epithet Lackland, because as a younger son he was not expected to inherit significant lands. His older brother, Richard I, often portrayed as the hero of those legends, was called Coeur de Lion, or Lionheart, because of a reputation for bravery. Frula II of the Iberian kingdom of Asturias was called Frula the Leper, and in fact, he died of leprosy. Other names, however, might be confusing. 13th century King Ivalio of Bulgaria was a peasant who rose to power at the head of a peasant army that defended Bulgaria from Tatar invasions. While he was known for his bravery, his epithet was the cabbage, or alternatively the radish or the lettuce. You might think that these were derogatory names referring to his brief one-year rule, but in fact they were epithets that were a reference to his peasant heritage. The epithets actually were inspiring, so much so Encyclopedia Britannica explains that his name lived on as two false Ivalios later tried to lead peasant revolts under the inspiring moniker of the man also known as Cabbage. Historian John Freed of Illinois State University suggested in his 2016 book on Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa that his epithet, which means red beard, was only coined a century after his death to allow historians to distinguish him from his grandson, Frederick II. The name was, Freed explains, not used in medieval Germany during Barbarossa's life, and his beard might not have been red, although at least one contemporary described it as having a reddish tinge. Meanwhile, the 16th century Ottoman admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa did not, by historical description, have a red beard at all. Instead, the epithet Redbeard was inherited from his brother after his death. One of Charles the Fat's vassals, Bernard, the Margrave of Aquitaine, had the epithet Plantipilosa, which is generally taken to mean hairy feet. But was he really a model for Bilbo Baggins? The website RootsWeb explains that the interpretation of his name comes from interpreting the planta part from the Latin, meaning bottom of the foot. However, Plantipilosa might actually be derived from the Basque language and might mean instead appearance, and that suggests that he might have been hairy, although not necessarily specifically his feet. Unfortunately, there's no clear historical description to suggest what might have been hairy about him. And he wasn't the only one. Michael Vargas writes on the website Making It Medieval that by legend, Wilfred, Count of Barcelona from 878 to 897, was called the Hairy because after returning from years of exile, his mother recognized him as she knew something about her son that remained unknown to others. He had hair where other men did not have it. Vargas explains, your guess is as good as mine about what she saw and where upon him she saw it. Planta pilosa isn't the only epithet which might have been mistranslated. The epithet of 10th century King Ethelred the Unready was coined a century and a half after his death. But the website History Extra writes it derives from a 12th century pun on his name. Ethelred, which would have been pronounced Avelred, literally meaning noble counsel or good counsel. By tweaking it with an old Middle English term unread, which means the opposite, ill-counseled or ill counsel, the nickname became a way for people to mock Ethelred. While the epithet is certainly insulting, it doesn't represent his poor preparation so much as it claims that he received poor counsel.
And this process of picking royal epithets hasn't gone away. A 2022 edition of the Norwich Evening News talked about proposed epithets to apply to Elizabeth II following her death, with former Prime Minister Boris Johnson calling her Elizabeth the Great in a floor speech before Parliament, although Reverend Richard Cole of the Anglican Church prefers the faithful. And of course, we use nicknames for all manner of sports stars or popular culture stars. I'll let you decide whether calling Irvin Johnson Magic or Michael Jackson the King of Pop or some YouTuber the History Guy qualifies. But every epithet is itself a piece of history. And of course, in this episode, I could only cover a small percentage of those. So if you want to mention more, feel free to do that in the comments. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.